Hi everyone, I'm Natalie. I am a CHEP intern, that is the Climate Health Education Project. We'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the webinar. And I'm in 10th grade and I go to Hopkins.
And I'm Bella. I'm a senior at Sacred Heart Academy in Hamden, and I am also a CHEP intern. So thank you all so much for being here tonight.
So to start off our webinar, we're going to have Ben from the Green New Deal Committee of the New Haven Climate Movement to tell us about the Green New Deal.
Hey everyone, my name's Ben. I go by he, him. I'm from what the white settlers call Guilford, but it's originally Quinnipiac territory. I wanted to give a little bit of context about New Haven Climate Movement and its history. And it was founded in 2015, and it was a response to what was perceived to be a lot of bureaucracy getting in the way of change that needed to happen, which I think is a recurring theme in our political system. And so the Green New Deal subcommittee is a portion of that that's focusing on pushing bolder legislation by mobilizing the public. And so right now we're running a campaign that's called Fridays for the Future. Every Friday, we have a list of people who call and call local and state officials and say, let's get moving. And although we say it a little bit more professionally than that, and I'll actually just drop that in the chat if anyone wants to sign up. So in terms of pushing like bold policy, we know like the basics of what needs to happen. We need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. We need to make sure that greenhouse gases and carbon are not being released. And then we also need to make sure that this transition is centering the needs and the people from overexploited populations. And so one group that's in my opinion they're doing a strong they're taking a strong approach on this is called CT Renew. And so we're collaborating with them, and they're much more active in the halls of the state. And so they take the approach that the climate crisis and COVID and racial injustice and economic injustice are all intertwined issues that need to be addressed. And I think, and so a couple of bills that are being pushed that I wanted to fill you guys in on are SB 356. SB just means Senate bill, and that's around energy retrofitting for affordable housing. There's another one, HB 6551, HB's House bill, and that is in regards to improving the air quality for communities that are located near high polluting facilities. SB 931 is trying to transition into cleaner trucking. And then SB 999 is a bill that's focusing on just transition to climate protective energy production and community investment, and focusing a lot on protecting workers in this transition. So those are like bills that are on the table this year in Connecticut. Yeah, I can do that in a minute. I can't multitask, unfortunately. And so they're on the table, and they need some pushing. They need some support on getting them passed. And they're positive, but the reality is that Connecticut's a very liberal state. A lot of Yale has a couple of polls that show how bold climate change policies are very popular in the state of Connecticut. Um, and we have a Democratic supermajority in the governor office, in the House, in the Senate, um, and this is a problem that needed to be addressed decades ago. And that's an interesting question to ask. Why wasn't it addressed decades ago? And the answers are revealing. You can't. They're not perfect answers, but there are good answers, and they're revealing. And we just came out of a situation in which the Senate Bill 718, which was around blocking construction for new fossil fuel plants, well, didn't make it out of committee. Um, and it needed to, and people were fighting for it and pushing for it. Sunrise, especially, I think, was taking the lead on this issue. And something as basic as that for the crisis that we're facing was a challenge, and also didn't rise to meet it. So um, I say that because in regards to the bold policies that are existing in Connecticut, there are some positive ones. And I don't know if it's ever happened in American history, maybe a few times, when it was the inner workings of the political system that brought positive change. It's never been that way. It's always been masses of people in the street. We can see with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's that force that has caused things to change, not politicians who go into back rooms and meet. I mean, the lobbying in Connecticut. Um, like Dominion Energy, and a natural gas service, has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars just last year in lobbying. I mean, bribing. We can call it bribing. I mean, I think lobbying and bribing, they might be, there might be some technicalities, but call it what it is. And they're not the only ones who are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so the point of saying that is to say, to what degree does the government actually serve the people that it represents, and or that it claims to represent, and that maybe in some ways it does, and that the bold policy that we need, that we are running out of time to implement, is not being implemented from the top down. It's always from bottom up mass movements. So yeah, that's all I think I have to say. And thank you. So get involved, even if it's like 5 minutes a week. Just start with like 5 minutes a week or less.
Yeah, and this is one of the ways you can get involved, sort of, by attending this webinar. So let me share my screen. Today we will go over current climate events like cherry blossoms in Japan, Antarctic ice shelves, and a new resistance movement to a Minnesota pipeline. Then we will talk about some proposed legislation that could help fight the climate crisis.
Every spring, Japan experiences the blooming of their famous cherry blossoms. These flowers, which experience a peak bloom that only lasts a few days, have been celebrated in Japan for more than 1,000 years. But this year, cherry blossom season has come and gone in the blink of an eye. In one of the earliest blooms on record, and scientists warn it's the symptom of the larger climate crisis threatening ecosystems everywhere. In the central city of Kyoto, cherry blossoms peaked on March 26th, which is the earliest peak in more than 1,200 years, according to historical researchers. And in the capital, Tokyo, cherry blossoms reached full bloom on March 22nd, the second earliest date on record. As global temperatures warm, the last spring frosts are occurring earlier and flowering is occurring sooner. The peak bloom dates shift every year, depending on numerous factors, including weather and rainfall, but have shown a general trend of moving earlier and earlier. In Kyoto, the peak date hovered around mid-April for centuries, but began moving into early April in the 1800s. The date has only dipped into late March a handful of times in recorded history. This year's seasons in particular influenced the blossom dates. The winter in Japan was very cold, but the spring came fast and unusually warm. The blossom's early bloom is just the tip of the iceberg of a worldwide phenomenon that could destabilize natural systems and countries' economies. There are two sources of increased heat, which is the main factor making these flowers bloom earlier: urbanization and climate change. With increased urbanization, cities tend to get warmer than the surrounding rural area in what's called the heat island effect. But a bigger reason is climate change, which has caused rising temperatures across the region and the world. And these earlier dates could have a lasting impact on entire ecosystems and threaten the survival of many species.
Plants and insects rely heavily on each other, and both use environmental cues to regulate the timing of different stages in their life cycles. For instance, plants sense the temperature around them, and if it's warm enough for a consistent period, they start to flower and their leaves start to emerge. Similarly, insects and other animals depend on temperature for their life cycles, meaning higher heat can cause faster growth. The relationship between plants and insects and other organisms has developed over thousands to millions of years, but in the recent century, climate change has disturbed those relationships. Different plants and insects may respond to the rise in heat at different paces, throwing their life cycles out of sync. They once timed their growth simultaneously each spring, but now flowers may bloom before insects are ready, and vice versa, meaning the insects may not find enough food to eat from the plants, and the plants don't have enough pollinators to reproduce. Over the past decade, some plant and animal populations have already begun shifting to both higher altitudes and higher latitudes to escape the effects of climate change. But it's becoming harder for ecosystems to adapt, with climate change making the weather more and more unpredictable. Though the trend of flowering dates is generally moving earlier, unexpected and extreme weather means that there is still huge variability year by year. Ecosystems are not accustomed to these kinds of large fluctuations, and it can cause them a lot of stress. Productivity may be reduced, and ecosystems may even collapse in the future. And the effects of climate change aren't just limited to cherry blossoms. The same phenomenon is already happening to many crops and economically valuable plants, posing big problems for food security and farmers' livelihoods. Food supplies in some of the most vulnerable regions in the world are being directly affected by droughts, crop failures, and locust swarms. In some regions, farmers may be forced to change the types of crops they grow. Some climates will become too hot for what they're growing now, while other climates will see more flooding, more snow, and more moisture in the air, which will also limit what can be grown. Farmers may have a much harder time predicting when they will have a good year and when they will have a bad year, because climate change is randomizing the things happening in our ecological systems.
A new study from the UK's University of Reading found that more than a third of the Antarctic ice shelf risks collapsing into the sea if global temperatures reach 4 degrees Celsius, which is 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels as climate change warms the world. In a forecasting study, scientists found that 34% of the area of all Antarctic ice shelves, measuring 500,000 square kilometers, could destabilize if the world temperatures were to rise by 4 degrees. 67% of the ice shelf area on the Antarctic Peninsula would be at risk of destabilization under this scenario, researchers said. Ice shelves are permanent floating platforms of ice attached to areas of the coastline, formed where glaciers are flowing off the land to meet the sea. They can help limit the rise in global sea levels by acting like a dam, slowing the flow of melting ice and water into the oceans. Each summer, ice at the surface of ice shelves melts and runs into smaller gaps in the snow below, where it usually refreezes. But when there's a lot of melting and a little snowfall, this water instead pools onto the ice's surface or flows into the crevices. This deepens and widens the crevices, causing the shelf to fracture and collapse into the sea. Ice shelves are important buffers, preventing glaciers on land from flowing freely into the ocean and contributing to sea level rise. When they collapse, it's like a giant cork being removed from a bottle, allowing unimaginable amounts of water from glaciers to pour into the sea. Low-lying coastal areas, particularly small island states in the South Pacific Ocean, are most at risk from global sea level rise, but coastal areas all over the world would be vulnerable, and countries with fewer resources available to mitigate and adapt to sea level rise will see worse consequences.
In this study, researchers say that limiting temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius rather than 4 degrees would have the area at risk and potentially avoid significant sea level rise. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded in a landmark report that we only have until 2030 to drastically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and prevent the planet from reaching the crucial threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre industrial levels. Global net emissions of carbon dioxide would need to fall by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and reach net zero around 2050 in order to keep the warming around 1.5 degrees Celsius. The findings highlight the importance of limiting global temperature increases as set out in the Paris Agreement, which we'll talk more about later, if we are to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, including sea level rise. In the Paris Agreement, 197 countries agreed to the goal of holding global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius above pre industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But we are on track for a world that is 3.2 degrees Celsius warmer by the end of the century. Increased temperatures means melting occurs more frequently and more intensely. Researchers identified 4 ice shelves that would be threatened by a warmer climate: the Larsen C, Shackleton, Pine Island, and Wilkins ice shelves, which are vulnerable due to their geography and the runoff predicted in those areas. Larsen C is the largest remaining ice shelf on the Antarctic Peninsula, and the Pine Island Glacier has received a lot of attention in recent years because it has been melting rapidly in response to climate change. One of the researchers explained that if these ice shelves all collapsed, which is not guaranteed, the glaciers that they currently restrain would flow into the ocean, contributing to sea level rise, potentially by tens of centimeters. So now we're going to move from those effects into more current events and this protest that's happening in Minnesota trying to stop a pipeline. The energy transportation company, Enbridge, has a permit to drill and lay the Line 3 pipeline underneath several crossings of the Mississippi River. This is a tar sands pipeline. Tar sands are a mixture of mostly sand, clay, water, and a thick molasses-like substance called bitumen. And bitumen is made of hydrocarbons and is used to produce gasoline and other petroleum products. On a lifetime basis, a gallon of gasoline made from tar sands produces about 15% more carbon dioxide emissions than one made from conventional oil. Tar sands also impact water supplies. For every gallon of gasoline produced by tar sands, about 5.9 gallons of fresh water are consumed during the extraction, upgrading, and refining process. That's roughly 3 times as much as used for conventional oil. Opponents say Line 3 is not in line with Biden's climate priorities, and they are asking him to revoke the permit for the pipeline that was approved in final weeks of the Trump administration. But Biden has not yet responded directly to Line 3 opponents' voices, so increasingly they've been putting themselves on the line. Here are some things that happened recently in Minnesota. A dozen protesters chained themselves to a bright green rope in the center of a worksite access road in the Savannah State Forest, seeking to delay further construction on the project. 7 other pipeline opponents formed a blockade in front of an Enbridge pump station by locking themselves to each other in the frigid cold, attempting to do the same. 2 more protesters locked themselves to a machine on a Line 3 worksite in St. Louis County. These are drastic examples of direct action to stop a project with national and global implications, but there has been little coverage of these direct actions in local, state, and national news outlets. Instead, most local Minnesota news outlets ran op-eds praising Line 3 for its short-term economic impacts. All called the pipeline a replacement rather than an expansion, obscuring the reality that Line 3 would double the current capacity of oil that could flow through the existing pipeline. That's just one of the many reasons pipeline opponents give for resorting to direct action. They say Enbridge has outspent them in both messaging and lobbying, and that there was never a real option for rejecting Line 3. Line 3 opponents argue that Enbridge never gave Minnesotans the option of not having a tar sands pipeline. They say Minnesotans only had 2 choices: keep the 50-year-old corroding pipeline that would inevitably spill, or allow a new pipeline that lets more high-polluting oil flow through the region. At a meeting in 2018, the Public Utilities Commission chairwoman broke down in tears, expressing how conflicted she was about allowing fossil fuels to cross the state for decades to come. She didn't want to allow that to happen, but she also didn't want to see an oil spill from the old pipeline. How would I feel if I woke up in 5 years and that line had leaked, she said. Enbridge poured money into the state government. The company's lobbying spending increased 790%. And in 2018, the Public Utilities Commission approved the permits necessary for Line 3. Then in 2020, the state auditor found that the Public Utilities Commission was not adequately prepared to administer meetings regarding a controversial pipeline and did not provide its staff with adequate guidance, support, or oversight, which resulted in inconsistent practices at the meetings. Pipeline opponents raise questions about the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's permit to Enbridge. Though the agency was supposed to assess environmental risk of the project, they say it refused to consider the potential impact of the pipeline's wetland crossings on water quality, the downstream effects of oil spills, and climate change. Because of the Pollution Control Agency's approval of Line 3's water quality permit, 12 out of 17 people tasked with advising the agency on environmental justice resigned in protest. And now some scientists who participated in the Line 3 process are supporting protesters taking direct action against the pipeline.
Political support for Line 3 in Minnesota has largely hinged on Enbridge's promise to provide local jobs. Enbridge had claimed that 75% of jobs were to be filled by Minnesotans. But in Enbridge's fourth quarter employment report for 2020, it said that only 33% of people working on Line 3 were from Minnesota, and 67% were from out of state. A journalist reporting on Line 3 found that Minnesota residents worked less hours than out-of-state workers, while non-residents worked almost 70% of total hours on Line 3. Minnesota residents worked just over 28% of total hours. There's nothing in the state's contract and permits with Enbridge that holds them accountable to meet the 75% target. Pipeline opponents cite this failure of the legal process as a reason for direct, nonviolent action. Line 3 opponents also say that Minnesotans are being misled about the need for oil within the pipeline. They often cite a ruling from Minnesota's own Department of Commerce that said Minnesota doesn't need the pipeline, in part because refineries in the state and the Midwest have already received all the oil they need. No oil pipelines in northern Minnesota would also violate treaty rights of surrounding Indigenous tribes by endangering critical natural and cultural resources in the 1842, 1854, and 1855 treaty areas. Pipeline opponents say that their case against Line 3 should be enough to get attention from the state governor, Tim Walz, Senators Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith, and President Joe Biden, especially since all have expressed climate change to be a top priority. But with the pipeline nearing 50% completion, none have called for immediate federal action. And so direct action seems to be like the only hope.
Now we're going to transition to some legislation that has been proposed in recent weeks. A few weeks ago, Biden released his infrastructure plan titled the American Jobs Plan. It includes money for climate initiatives. The largest single climate related provision in the plan is $213 billion to build, modernize, and weatherize affordable housing, an idea that brings together Biden's climate and economic justice goals. The plan would tackle homes and buildings, the source of 40% of all US carbon emissions, while addressing the shortage of quality housing for low income communities of color. Biden is calling on Congress to develop a new competitive grant program that would give state and local governments incentive to eliminate exclusionary zoning policies that have made it difficult for so many families to find affordable housing. Biden proposes spending $174 billion to accelerate a transition to electric vehicles in the United States through consumer incentives like tax credits to purchasers of electric vehicles, the building of a network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations, and direct federal spending. For example, there will be federal funding for converting to electric school buses, and Biden proposes electrifying the entire federal fleet of vehicles, including those of the US Postal Service. The proposal also includes $100 billion for power grid modernization and resilience, both intended to help America avoid catastrophic outages like the one that caused 70 deaths in February, and to upgrade the system to better handle and transport wind and solar energy. Biden would make a historic $85 billion investment in modernizing public transit. This comes after a year in which 65% of mass transit services had to cut service because of the drop in ridership and revenue resulting from the COVID pandemic. That investment would come on top of the $30.5 billion that was in Biden's COVID relief bill to help mass transit systems, which typically only get $10 billion annually in federal funding. A key aim of the program is to bring bus, rapid transit, and rail service to underserved communities and neighborhoods across the country.
The plan also calls for a $35 billion investment in clean technology research and development, including the launching of a new incubator for cutting-edge research. Biden proposes spending $15 billion in demonstration projects that will tackle climate, like utility-scale energy storage, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, advanced nuclear, rare earth element separation, and floating offshore wind. Biden would spend $16 billion employing union oil and gas workers to cap abandoned oil and gas wells and clean up mines, helping address unemployment in fossil fuel communities and addressing emissions of the climate superpollutant methane, which is a greenhouse gas, from the old facilities. Biden's package includes broad increases in corporate taxes, but he steered clear of including a carbon tax, though the idea has recently won support in the oil industry. Neither Biden nor Democrats on Capitol Hill have expressed an enthusiasm for the idea. But Biden would fulfill his campaign pledge of eliminating fossil fuel industry subsidies, which are estimated to add up to at least $20 billion annually. Biden's plan for the first time would establish a federal energy efficiency and clean electricity standard, requiring utilities to deliver a certain percentage of electricity from renewable or other clean energy sources. Although his plan did not spell out initial goals, Biden's aim is to put the nation on track to a 100% carbon pollution-free electricity sector by 2035. In a direct nod to FDR's New Deal, Biden would invest $10 billion in a new civilian climate corps, in addition to conservation of public lands and water projects, which was the focus of Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps. Biden's Climate Conservation Corps would be deployed on projects to bolster community resilience and advance environmental justice.
So, what are people saying about this? I color coordinated this slide The yellow are people who are iffy about it. There's some good things and some bad things. The red are people or organizations who don't like the plan, and the green are people or organizations who do. Some activists have accused Biden's administration of failing to propose a blueprint that would satisfy his promise to zero out carbon emissions from the power grid by 2035 and across the economy by 2050. This claim was made by groups such as Food and Water Watch and the Center for Biological Diversity. Much of the criticism of Biden's plan revolves around activist complaints that the plan's spending proposals are too modest to achieve meaningful carbon reductions and include technologies that would undermine efforts to curb fossil fuels. Many environmentalist groups oppose one of those technologies, carbon capture and sequestration, as a lifeline for the coal, oil, and natural gas companies that have long used political influence to impede climate policy. But Biden has backed the emerging technology to help win over unions and fossil fuel state lawmakers who worry about the economic consequences of a shift to clean energy. Many environmental and climate activists say that Biden's plan is a good starting point, but isn't enough as is. The Sunrise Movement, a national youth climate activist group, noted some of the good things about Biden's plan, including the funding of a civilian climate corps, working on universal clean water, and equity and justice investments in disadvantaged communities. But they also said that the plan wasn't adequately committed to the full scale of transformation that is needed in our economy.
A bill put forth by Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Robert Mendez is designed to make climate change a pillar of U.S. diplomacy, boosting initiatives to help other nations cut emissions and adapt to a warming world. The bill seeks to infuse climate into everything from export and development finance decisions to Arctic policy planning to creating a new international pressure on China. The bill is over 200 pages, so we're not going to be able to go over everything it says right now, but it includes new work to assess how climate change can affect security by causing disruptions that fuel instability, affect global food and water systems, and affect military operations and more. Authorizing $14 billion in U.S. contributions to the multilateral Green Climate Fund over half a decade, boosting U.S. participation in multinational efforts to cut emissions from transportation, improve land use planning, crack down on methane, and more, implementing a new program involving the EPA and Agriculture Department to combat international deforestation, provisions to more clearly make clean energy a part of the existing Power Africa program that works to boost electricity access, and a new Women in Climate Change Act focused on addressing the impacts of warming on women and girls. Mendez said in a statement that the bill would help ensure that Congress does its part in providing resources, programs, and policy to expedite the restoration of our nation's climate diplomacy and leadership. The overall bill faces significant hurdles in the deeply divided Senate, given that many Republicans oppose the Paris climate deal and allege that Democratic climate priorities create economic risks. But a committee spokesperson for Mendez said that there are plenty of provisions that Republicans may very well want to join in pushing forward. So this is more about finding a way to garner bipartisan support for these broader reforms.
So now we're going to talk about the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties at Conference of the Parties 21 in Paris on December 12, 2015, and entered into force on November 4, 2016. It builds on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Its goal is to limit warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. To achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible to achieve a climate-neutral world by mid-century. The Paris Agreement is a landmark in the multilateral climate change process because, for the first time, a binding agreement brings all nations into a common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change and adapt to its effects. How does it work? The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action carried out by countries. By 2020, countries submit their plans for climate action, known as Nationally Determined Contributions or NDCs. In their NDCs, countries communicate actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Countries also communicate in the NDCs actions they will take to build resilience to adapt to the impacts of rising temperatures. To better frame the efforts towards the long-term goal, the Paris Agreement invites countries to formulate and submit long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, LT-LEDs, by 2020. LT-LEDs provide the long-term horizon to the NDCs. Unlike NDCs, they are not mandatory, but they place the NDCs into the context of countries' long-term planning and development priorities, providing a vision and direction for future development.
Okay, so why are we talking about this now? The Paris Climate Agreement, though deemed too lackluster by many activists, is the most modern international form of climate action and accountability. It's especially important for us to discuss this now, as the US recently rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement through President Biden's executive order on February 19, 2021. The US first joined the Paris Agreement back in 2015. Former President Barack Obama was able to formally enter the United States into the agreement under the international law through executive authority, since it imposed no new legal obligations on the country. The US has a number of tools already on the books, under laws already passed by Congress to cut carbon pollution. The country formally joined the agreement in September 2016 after submitting its proposal for participation. The Paris Agreement could not take effect until at least 55 nations representing at least 55% of global emissions had formally joined. This happened on October 5th, 2016, and the agreement went into force 30 days later on November 4th, 2016. However, the US was formally pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement under former President Donald Trump. Trump had been a strong climate change denier throughout his campaign and announced in June of 2017 that he intended to pull the US out of the agreement. The US was officially withdrawn from the agreement on November 4th, 2020, which was the earliest possible date under the agreement and a day after the presidential election. Thankfully, even a formal withdrawal can be reversed since a future president can always rejoin. Despite Trump's announcement in 2017, US envoys continued to participate in UN climate negotiations to solidify details of the agreement. Meanwhile, thousands of leaders nationwide stepped forward to fill the void created by the lack of federal climate leadership, reflecting the will of the vast majority of Americans who support the Paris Agreement. Among city and state officials, business leaders, universities, and private citizens, there has been a groundswell of participation in initiatives such as America's Pledge, the United States Climate Alliance, We Are Still In, and the American Cities Climate Change. The complementary and sometimes overlapping movements aim to deepen and accelerate efforts to tackle climate change at the local, regional, and national levels. This new era of US climate leadership represents our best chance to course correct in the global race to tackle climate change. In fact, Biden's climate plan is the most comprehensive ever undertaken by a US president, and he intends to rally international leaders to cut emissions even more aggressively than under the goals of the Paris Agreement. Of course, there's always more work to be done, so it's important to continue to pressure the Biden administration into upholding their plans to tackle the climate crisis.
President Biden has invited 40 world leaders, including those of top emitters China and India, to the Leaders Summit on Climate he will host on April 22nd and 23rd, so that starts tomorrow. This summit will be a key milestone on the road to the United Nations Climate Change Conference this November. In his invitation, Biden urged leaders to use the summit as an opportunity to outline how their countries will contribute to stronger climate ambition. The summit will reconvene the US-led Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate, which brings together 17 countries responsible for approximately 80% of global emissions. The president also invited the heads of other countries that are demonstrating strong climate leadership and heads of countries that are especially vulnerable to climate impacts. A small number of business and civil society leaders will also participate in the summit. According to the White House website, key themes of the summit will include galvanizing efforts by the world's major economies to reduce emissions during this critical decade to keep a limit to warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach, mobilizing public and private sector finance to drive the net zero transition and to help vulnerable countries cope with climate impacts, the economic benefits of climate action, with a strong emphasis on job creation and the importance of ensuring all communities and workers benefit from the transition to a new clean energy economy, spurring transformational technologies that can help reduce emissions and adapt to climate change while also creating many new economic opportunities and building the industries of the future, showcasing subnational and non state actors that are committed to green recovery and an equitable vision for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and are working closely with national governments to advance ambition and resilience, discussing opportunities to strengthen capacity to protect lives and livelihoods from the impacts of climate change, addressing the global security challenges posed by climate change, and the impact on readiness, and addressing the role of nature based solutions in achieving net zero by 2050 goals.
Okay, so what have the top emitters pledged so far? The first one is China. Last year, China announced that it is aiming for carbon neutrality, meaning the amount of carbon removed from the atmosphere equals or exceeds which is emitted by 2060. Beijing also pledged to reach a peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and have renewable energy sources account for 25% of its total energy consumption by 2030. However, China has yet to formally submit its new nationally determined contributions, NDCs. The United States, which is behind only China emissions, the United States left the Paris Agreement under the Trump administration, but rejoined earlier this year. It previously committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% from its 2005 level by 2025. But most recently, it was just reported that under President Biden at his climate summit, will pledge to cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least half by 2030. 3 people with connections to the White House spoke to the news source we got this information from, so it's not yet confirmed. This pledge would be non-binding, but it's still symbolically important. A Georgia Tech climate scientist, Kim Cobb, said that Biden's target would put us roughly in line with the most ambitious emissions reductions targets projected by scientists and environmentalists. Cobbs and other experts have said that the details of Biden's strategy will be crucial, because those details will likely determine whether this ambitious new goal can be translated into policy. Senator Ed Markey, who introduced the Green New Deal, said the 50% target was appropriate to meet the scope and scale of the climate crisis.
The world's third largest emitter, the European Union, already submitted its updated NDCs, which sets a goal of cutting emissions by 55% of its 1990 level by 2030, higher than its original target of 40%. Like the United States, it aims to be carbon neutral by 2050. Experts point out that even with their updated NDCs, the EU and China are not on track to avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. In its original NDCs, India, the fourth largest emitter, pledged to have renewable energy sources account for 40% of its total electricity generation by 2030 and to significantly boost forest coverage. It also aims to reduce its emissions per unit of gross domestic product, a ratio known as emissions intensity, by 33 to 35% from its 2005 level. So, in summary, first we talked about some effects of climate change, the cherry blossoms blooming early, and the growing risk of ice shelves melting. We also talked about the fight against a climate change causing new pipeline And then we went over some proposed legislation like Biden's American Jobs Plan that includes climate initiatives and a bill that will tie in foreign relations with the climate crisis. We then talked about past and future events like the Paris Agreement and the Leaders Summit on Climate happening tomorrow.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about our organizations, because one of the best ways to get involved in the fight against the climate crisis is to hit up your local organizations. One of them is obviously the New Haven Climate Movement. The New Haven Climate Movement is an intergenerational grassroots organization of New Haven area residents. In 2018, we passed the New Haven Climate and Sustainability Framework, which outlines key strategies to address the climate emergency in New Haven. We also passed the New Haven Climate Emergency Resolution in 2019, which calls for zero emissions by 2030 and a city mobilization task force. In 2020, we got the city to commit to $560,000 in capital funding towards climate infrastructure projects through our 0.1% for the future proposal, as well as $50,000 in their general 2020 budget towards climate solutions. But if New Haven is going to create a sustainable and just city for all with net zero carbon emissions and a resilient economy, there is so much work left to be done. Some of our current projects include climate justice and Green Jobs Fund, climate education, electric future, and the CT Green New Deal, which you heard from one of their members earlier.
And I'm going to talk about a little bit about CHEP, or the Climate Health Education Project. CHEP is an online resource for educators who want to bring climate education into their schools. We have different types of resources for English, social studies, science, and art classes, as well as clubs and student-led activities. We have 7 current interns from high schools all around the New Haven area who are creating and distributing climate educational materials, organizing webinars just like this one, producing educational videos and graphics, engaging teachers and administrators, and organizing teacher workshops on climate education. We are hosting one other webinar this week. It is on Friday at 7, so the same time as this one. It's going to be on human health and climate change. So if you're interested in that, you will receive an email for that. So that email will have the Zoom link and everything you need, because you did sign up for this. So we're going to also send you the email for that. So that's all for this webinar. If you have any questions about climate activism or how to get involved with the New Haven Climate Movement, please reach out to Bella or me. You can also find New Haven Climate Movement on Instagram or Facebook. And also you can find CHEP on Instagram or Facebook. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thanks for coming.